I'd like to give you a hearty welcome. I'm really excited about the fact that we're going to spend, and maybe I should say invest, 5 sessions in talking about an extremely important topic, and that topic is leadership. And we're going to talk about that topic from a very important book, which is this book right here, the Bible. So as we start, usually when I talk with folks, I like to sort of give them a little bit of my background and then get a little idea of your background. I was raised in a pastor's home. My dad was a bivocational pastor. Now, if you don't know what a bivocational pastor is, that's church talk for we want you to be our pastor, but we can't pay you. And so I got introduced to leadership at an early age. And so over the years, I've had about 3 different worlds where I've had the opportunity to be a leader. In the church world, in the corporate world, and then over in the civic world. And so in the church world, I've been a pastor, I've been a deacon, youth leader, college leader, chapel leader. I've chaired building committees, salary committees, search committees, all of those fun committees. And then I've also spent 30 years in the corporate world. And in the corporate world, I held positions from frontline supervisor all the way up to the executive level. And I've had the opportunity to help form a corporate university, opportunity to work a lot of different projects. And then in the community, I've worked with Red Cross, United Way, Chamber of Commerce, and several areas there. But I don't consider myself an expert on leadership. I consider myself a student and a teacher in leadership. And it's like Paul says that, I've not arrived. Now, one thing about experience is I can tell you a lot of things that won't work. So you can sort of exclude those. But the key is I want to teach you about leadership from a biblical basis. What does the Bible have to say about leadership? And it's amazing how much the Bible does have to say about leadership. So I'm going to use Bible examples. I'll use some personal experiences. We'll also give you some quotes and some experience from some well-known leaders. And the interesting thing about teaching on leadership is this. When I teach these principles in the corporate world, people will say, well, that might work in the church world, but it won't work out here, quote, in the real world. But even more surprising, when I teach this in the church world, I have people say, well, these principles might work in the church, in the corporate world, but they won't work here in the church. But I know from experience, and I know from based on God's Word, these principles work. And it's not cultural, because I've had the opportunity to teach these same principles in New Zealand, in Russia, in Lithuania, and Romania, and these work. So I want you to understand that. Now, let me get a little feel for who you are. How many of you are in ministry? Okay, quite a few. How many of you have leadership positions maybe in the school system or you're teachers? Okay. How many of you are a supervisor or have some leadership role in business or corporations? All right. Now some of you are probably saying, well, that leaves me out. No, it doesn't. How many of you are parents? How many of you are husbands? Because you see, everyone will experience some leadership function in some area of their life. And so what I want to do over these sessions that we spend together is I want to whet your appetite about leadership. I want you to want to know more about leadership, to be a better leader, and to start reading, working, and striving to be a better leader. Because this is what it's all about. Now, specifically, let's talk about what we're going to cover. I want to talk with you about the purpose and the importance of leadership. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes in this first session sort of building the case for leadership, why it's important. I want to define leadership for you tonight. I want you to understand what it is. And then I'll talk with you a little bit about qualifications. Do leaders have qualifications? You bet they do. In fact, more is required of leaders than required of other people. We'll talk about some promises that God makes to leaders. Not only does He make promises, but along with that promise, He gives power for a leader. And then we'll get into more details of what the leadership process is. And we'll start that in subsequent sessions. Perils. Leadership is dangerous. And I want to talk with you about some of the perils of leadership. And then we'll talk about development. 2 phases of development is development of self and then development of other people. And then we'll end up talking about succession. And you'll hear something like this: there is no success without succession. So these are the areas. Now, I have a firm belief that everything you really need to know about leadership you can find in God's Word. And based on that, here are some truths that drop out from that. First, the sole purpose of leadership is what? To achieve God's objectives. Leadership is a process. Leadership qualifications are in sort of 3 areas: relationship, character, and competence. And then God does not call where He does not provide. That's important to remember. And we'll talk about this leadership process of vision, planning, and execution. We'll define leadership. That's the what. Then we'll move on to the process, which is how do you do this? And then we'll talk about some of the temptations that plague followers as well as leaders. And then a leader must develop self before developing others. And then finally, there is no success without succession. So let's define leadership. What is the purpose of leadership? Have you ever wondered about that? You know, sometimes you think, well, the purpose of leadership is more or less just punishment if you've been in a leadership position. But the purpose of leadership, sole purpose of leadership, is to achieve God's objectives. Some things about leadership I understand. There's some I don't understand. One thing I do not understand is this principle, and that is God uses men and women to accomplish His will through leadership. Have you ever wondered about that? I mean, here's an all-powerful God, but yet He chose to use men and women as leaders in positions of leadership to accomplish His objectives. Over the course of time, God has used godly leaders to accomplish His objectives. Moses to lead the Hebrews to the Promised Land. He used Nehemiah to rebuild the walls. Paul to evangelize the Roman Empire. But God has also used ungodly people to accomplish His will. Who financed the Exodus from Egypt? It was Pharaoh. Jehu, if you're an Old Testament scholar, was used by God to remove Ahab's lineage. Nebuchadnezzar was the one that actually God used to take Judah into captivity. And then another king, Artaxerxes, God used to rebuild the walls. And if you look at time in the Old Testament and the New Testament, if you just go through and look at the different titles that are used, God uses various titles and differing roles in the Old Testament. He uses patriarch, or the family head. He used priest, prophet, commander, captain, judge. And then what about in the New Testament? Pastor, elder, bishop. So He used a lot of different titles to accomplish His will. But in every case, it's ultimately God who's in charge. If you look over in Proverbs 21:1 sometimes, it says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water He turneth whithersoever He will." So God is the one that's ultimately in control. And then the success or failure of every organization depends upon the leadership. If you look at failures in organizations today, in the family, in the church, in the school, in corporations, in our nation, it's linked to failures in leadership. John Maxwell makes this statement, and I believe it. Everything rises or falls on leadership. In corporate mergers or takeovers, do you know what the first thing that's done? Quite frequently they talk about mergers of equals. Let me tell you, there are no mergers of equals. There is the one who is heading the merger and the other who is getting merged. And the first thing they do in the corporation that is merging into another one, they remove all the leadership. And you think, well, that's a brutal thing to do. No. Because that company would not be faltering and would not be merged if they had good leadership. So the first thing they do is remove all the levels of leadership. What about in warfare? What happens in warfare? You remember Desert Shield and Desert Storm? What was the first thing that happened? They went in and removed the leaders. Or they destroyed all the communication. In other words, they were trying to remove the leaders so that you can conquer the army. Get a little more personal. Let me share a few statistics with you in the home. These are statistics of a family following father, mother in church attendance. If the father is irregular and the mother is regular, only 3% of the children will become regular in church. On the other hand, if the father's regular and the mother's irregular, 38% of the children will become regular in church. Of course, if you have father and mother, then the percentage goes up higher. So guys, what does that say? That says you're to be the spiritual leader of the home. And how you lead, success or failure, is going to be largely linked to you as the leader in the home. So you have to understand that. A leader's decision and direction impact the lives of the followers not only in the present, but for generations. This is a sobering thought, because this happens in families. If there's a lack of leadership in a family, particularly with a father, that transmits on down into later generations. Let me give you an example in the Old Testament. You remember a gentleman by the name of Jeroboam? At the end of Solomon's reign, there was a split in the kingdom. There was Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Jeroboam took the 10 northern tribes, and if you read in Samuel and Kings, what you'll find is that from that point on, because of how ungodly Jeroboam was, the 10 northern tribes, or Israel, never returned to God. Now, the southern 2 tribes was a little bit different with Rehoboam. It was sort of hit or miss. But it was based upon whether the king was godly or not, as to whether Judah was godly. So we need to understand that leadership is not only in the present, but it significantly impacts the future. An organization takes on the personality, values, character, and direction of the leader, and it eventually follows the leader either to success or to failure. Here's something to watch. If you're a leader, what you say sometimes even your mannerism, people will pick up. It's a sobering thought. I can remember once I visited a work center, and I had this map, and we were going to do some reorganizations, and so I had pins on that map, and so I was trying to get that out of the car, and one of the pins fell out. And I thought, man, I don't know where that pin went. So I put the pin in my pocket. And so here comes the leader in to explain the reorganization. And who do you think found that empty spot? It was the supervisor that his pin dropped out. And so just a small thing that we think as a leader can have significant impacts because people watch you and people mimic you, even down to gestures and what you have to say. So I hope I'm building the case for you that leadership is extremely important. Now, what I want to do is refer you to the New Testament, and I want to give you two models of leadership. And this is found over in Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 through 28. But you can find parallel verses in Mark and also in Luke. Listen to this. Let me sort of give you an idea of what was going on. First, James and John's mother had come to Jesus and said, I have a small favor to ask of you, Jesus. And what I would like is that when you come into your kingdom, would you set one of my sons on the left and one on the right? Fair request, right, mothers? Well, the Lord told her that this is not my decision to make. My Father makes that. This is what had gone on. Now, the other disciples heard this. And so what happened? In the preceding verses, they're into this argument of who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And so here Christ had invested His life in these 12 men and is going to turn over the kingdom to these 12, and they're out there squabbling who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And I can just see what's happening. The Lord says, okay, time out. Let's talk about this. And so this is where these verses pick up. But Jesus called them unto Him, time out, and said, Know ye that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority over them. That is a secular view of leadership. Then He said, But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give His life a ransom for many. Now, a lot of people take these verses and misapply them. They take this verse and say that a leader should abdicate, ought to cater to their followers, ought to placate and ask the followers, what do you want to do? This is not what Christ was talking about. Christ exercised strong leadership. So what is He talking about in these verses? And what He's talking about is what's over here. He shows two models of leadership. Now you see this all the time. It may not have dawned on you, but you can see this. In a biblical model, who's the authority? God is. In a secular model, who is in authority? Self, the leader. What about the purpose? In a biblical model, God's purpose is what is important. In a secular model, self is what's important. Skip on down here. What about the focus? In a biblical model, the focus is outward on other people. In a secular model, it's inward on the leader. Now, this is what I want you to understand. Who are the beneficiaries of leadership? This is a crucial principle. The key to leadership is understanding who the leader is to benefit. In a biblical model, who is the beneficiary? It's the followers. In a secular model, who is the beneficiary? The leader. You see a difference there? Understand this. God puts a person in a position of leadership not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the people that they lead. Folks, it's amazing how that works. It's amazing how that works. 2 Samuel 5 and 12, you might want to just jot this down. And David perceived that the Lord had established him king over Israel, that he had exalted his kingdom for his people Israel's sake. So why did God put David in charge? Not for David's benefit, but for the benefit of those that he led. In Esther, with Mordecai, Esther chapter 10 verse 3, for Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and seeking peace to all his need. Now, just imagine with me. Imagine if every leader knew that they were in a position of leadership for the benefit of the people that they led. Would that be different? That would be significantly different. What happens in government? And I'm not bashing politicians, but what happens? If you will elect me, I will represent you. Then they get in office. Who do they tend to represent? They represent themselves. And I've seen this in the church world. I've seen this in the corporate world. And there is a significant difference between who people will trust. Because if a leader exhibits that I'm in a position of leadership for the benefit of my people, they know that. And we're going to talk about that because that is so significant. There's a lack of strong biblical leadership in every area of our society. Do you believe that?
Yeah.
What's wrong with our families? Guys, I'm going to pick on you. Generally, it's because men won't man up and lead as a husband and lead as a dad. What about churches? You want to find in churches? I don't find so much a lack of leadership at the top, but what I find is you get down past a staff level and a lack of leadership. You get this philosophy, well, that's what the pastor and that's what the staff is supposed to do. Do you know that the average church, in the churches that I'm aware of, do you know what the average membership is? Anywhere from 60 to 80. Why is that? Because that's about all one person can, quote, lead by themselves without some other leaders. What about our schools? Have you noticed things changing there? Lack of leadership there? Do you realize that academically we have moved from up close to the top to sort of middle? I don't have to say anything about the violence in schools. It's about a lack of leadership. What about corporations? You still remember Enron, but even more currently, you remember bailouts of financial institutions, bailout of automotive giants. What was that about? Lack of leadership. What about our nation? Folks, our leaders can't even pass a budget. So there is significant lack of leadership in all of those areas. Now, we could stop there and say, ain't it bad, ain't it sad, woe, woe is us, and go home. Because there is a lack of leadership. But let me tell you, that leaves the door open for tremendous opportunities. This is one thing I've always found. I love working in vacuums when no one will step up and lead. That's an opportunity to lead. And God puts you in those positions. So we've got to understand what leadership is, but here's the good news. God's looking for men and women to step forward and lead. And this is what this is about. To teach, motivate, and then teach men and women to step up and lead. Let me read a verse out of 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show Himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward Him. What an opportunity. What an opportunity. You can look at a lack of leadership as an obstacle, or you can understand that a lack of leadership is an opportunity to step up and lead. Do you think we need godly men to step up and lead their families? Do you think we need people in our churches who will step up and lead? Do you think in businesses there's a need for leadership? Folks, I've found in every area that I've been in, there's always more people willing to follow than to lead. People will sit there and wait for someone to lead. What would happen in our government if we had godly men who would go into office and lead? You know a guy named Mike Huckabee? Mike Huckabee was in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He pastored a church there. And the interesting thing about that is when Mike decided to run for office, and of course he became governor of Arkansas and then, made an attempt at president. But he had a lot of people say, well, he's a preacher. He shouldn't get into politics. Let me ask you this. If Mike had stayed and pastored a church, and that's a God call, okay? But don't you think God calls men in other areas of leadership? Do you think he has possibly more impact now than he would have had he stayed and pastored a church? God calls. God calls in leadership. Now, I want to define leadership for you. Now, this is a mouthful. So don't don't break and run on me. It's a process. Henry Blackaby makes a statement. I really love this. He says, leadership is simply moving people onto God's agenda. And you say, well, can I do that in the corporate world? Absolutely. I've seen it done. Okay, here's the definition. Leadership is a process of influencing, enlisting, engaging, and equipping people over a period of time to achieve identifiable results. Now, a lot of words there, but we're going to unpack that word at a time, okay? So what is leadership? It is a process of influencing, enlisting, engaging, and equipping people over a period of time to achieve identifiable results. This is the what. Later we'll talk about how do you do that. First of all, leadership is not a one-time event, it's a process. And it has a beginning and continues over a period of time and has a definite end. And all throughout the Bible, you see this leadership process. Let's use the example of Moses. What was God's agenda? God's agenda was to move the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt up to the Promised Land and to occupy the Promised Land. Moses prepared. If you look at Moses' life, it was busted up into 3 40-year segments. The first 40 years he spent in Egypt learning. The second 40 years he spent on the backside in Midian learning survival techniques. And then God prepared him for his third segment of leading the people out of Egypt. Now, do you see the process? God called him. What was the purpose? To lead God's people to the Promised Land and to occupy it. But God chose Moses to do that. But then when Moses got to the Promised Land, God changed leaders. So you see this process, it started and had a definite end. And that's what you need to understand about a leadership process. You'll go through this cycle time and time again. But you start and then you get to the end of that process. So it's a process, not a one-time event. The very heart of influence of leadership is influencing people. If you don't learn anything else, learn this. Leadership is about relationships. Leadership is about relationships. If you think you're a leader and no one's following, you're just taking a walk. And let me tell you another thing. If you have to remind everybody that you're the leader, you're not the leader. Because you see, leadership is all about influencing people to a specific point of view. You have to be able to convince them to your point of view. Can you imagine? Well, I mean, the Scriptures tell us. Moses went in to Egypt and said, okay, I'm going to take you all out of Egypt and we're going to the Promised Land. How did they receive that? Like, hey, aren't you the guy that killed that person and had to run for his life? And you want to lead us out? So Moses had some influencing to do. But you know, God gave him that influence. Of course, it helps to be able to take a rod and throw it down. It turns into a snake. Now, you know, I wish I could tell you need to do that. But there's ways to influence people, and we'll talk about that in other sessions. Then, leaders must influence people past agreement with the leader's point of view to accepting the view as their own. That's what enlisting is about. And then to become involved with implementation, that's engaging. So what are we talking about? You move through these steps from a follower says, yes, I believe what my leader's saying. I believe it's true. That's influencing. What is enlisting? It's moving to the point, yeah, I believe that also. Now, this is where a lot of leadership stops. Because you see a lot of people in church, and you see it in corporations, and you see it in civic organizations is, yeah, I believe what the leader says is true. I believe him. Or he or she is a reputable person. And I believe that too. And I believe they ought to do it. They're not engaged. And as a leader, that's one of the biggest hurdles right there. To move people from influence them, to enlist them, then to engage them. And that's when a person says, I want to be a part of this. I want to do this. Help me, show me what I need to do. Then comes the equipping. After enlisting and engaging the people, the leader must train and supply the needs of the followers, equipping in order for them to be effective. Now, this is where a lot of leaders fail in the training. You get someone with a lot of zeal and a lot of ignorance, and how does that work for you? There's an old English proverb that says, don't put a sword in the hand of a madman. And sometimes we can get people all enthused and motivated, but if we haven't trained them, it's like nitro and glycerin. In other words, it can really be destructive. So you have to equip people if you're going to expect them to perform. And then, few significant results are quickly achieved. Therefore, the leader must be able to maintain the influence over a period of time to achieve the objective. How long did it take Moses to get from the Promised Land or from Egypt to the Promised Land? It was over 40 years, right? Have you ever looked at that on a map? That ain't a 40-year journey. But it took him 40 years, it took God 40 years to get the people right. Now I'm going to share a little of my experience. You don't see this much anymore, and I thank the Lord for this. Does the term annual call mean anything to you? Some of you say, yeah, I know what you're talking about, and others are like, what are you talking about? In a lot of churches, it used to be that every year they would have an annual call. And they would decide, do we want this pastor to be our pastor for another year? And I could remember as a kid, I really enjoyed that. Because that meant after Dad preached, then we had to leave. And we would wait at home for the call of were we going to be back for a year or were we not. And I'll be honest with you, there was a lot of times I just wished we weren't. But when you look at that, do you know what happens? If you look back in that era, the average length of a pastor's stay at a church was about 2 years. There's the honeymoon year and then the year where people decide they don't want to follow. And what got accomplished? Not a whole lot. And so what I want to encourage you as a leader is this. It's not going to happen overnight, folks. It's going to take time. Now, the goal of leadership is to achieve identifiable results. Let me ask you this. If Nehemiah, well, let me just go back to Moses. If Moses had not gotten the Hebrew people to the Promised Land, would he have been a success? I know there was a question there for a while because they were just wandering around out in the wilderness. There are therapeutic leaders. Do you know what a therapeutic leader is? They are people that keep everybody happy, but they don't get anything accomplished. And they have what I call therapeutic staff meetings. And they come and they talk about everything that's wrong and they feel good about it. But once they leave, they haven't decided anything. They haven't decided who's going to do what, to what level, and when. So you see, as a leader, there has to be identifiable results. Or else we haven't accomplished anything as a leader. Now, let me give you some misconceptions about leadership. Now, I want you to soak that in, that definition of leadership, because in later sessions we're going to talk about, well, how do you influence people? How do you enlist them? How do you engage them? It's important that you understand first what you're doing, then we'll talk about how you do it. Let me give you some misconceptions about leadership. Probably the greatest misconception about leadership is assuming that it's based upon position. In other words, the position makes the leader, right? No. The position doesn't make the leader makes the position. What does that mean? I've had people that worked for me before that said, I really want to be promoted. I said, well, great. Then you need to increase your performance. Well, if you will promote me, then I'll increase my performance. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. This is what I've always learned, is that it's the leader that makes the position rather than the position that makes the leader. Let me give you an example of that. I worked for a large corporation, and we had, over a 2-state area, had a lot of work centers. And I would visit these work centers, and each work center had what was the recognized leader. It would be, we call them area line supervisors. And you'd go to that work center, and supposedly this was the person in charge. Well, I would go to those work centers, and I would go to the meetings. And if we were trying to start a new process or maybe a new work practice, we would go out and talk with the linemen about what we need to change. And what I would do, I would go to that work center and I would sit in the meetings and I would talk with them, but I would sit back and watch. And then I'd ask a question. And over half the time, when I would ask a question, every head in that room would turn and look at one, generally a senior lineman. Now, what did that tell me? That's your leader. That's the one that had the influence. Sometimes it was the supervisor, but quite frequently the supervisor had the title, but there was someone else that had the leadership position. Now, if you want to influence that work group, who do you go to influence? The supervisor in that case, or do you go to influence the person who is really the informal leader? See, this is what I was saying. Like vacuums. Vacuums are great in organizations. In other words, no one is willing to lead. So if God's laying that on your heart, step in that position and lead. You don't have to have the title to be a leader. In fact, leadership is not based on position. It's based on just stepping up and doing it. Here's another one. Leadership is not based upon prior knowledge, giftedness, or even power, as evidenced by Christ's selection of the 12 disciples and later disciples that were called. Look in 1 Corinthians 1:26. For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. You remember Samuel going and choosing David? What did God tell Samuel, and Samuel then told Jesse? He said, God told me not to look on the outside, but to look on the inside. So you see, when God calls into a leadership position, don't allow yourself to be intimidated about, well, I don't have all the skills yet. Here's another one. Great leaders are not born as such, but they become so by learning and applying biblical principles. You remember Gideon? Boy, you talk about someone that was a whiner. Who, me? Well, I'm of the least of the tribe. And not only least of the tribe, but the least family in the tribe. And not only that, I'm the least person in my family. But leadership is not based on... Now there are some people who exhibit characteristics that maybe they're more extroverted, and maybe it's a little easier for them to get up and speak before people or whatever. But leadership is not based... You're not born as a leader. You learn as a leader. You learn those principles and you apply them. Let me See if you can guess who this leader is. He was born in Tampico in Whiteside County, Illinois. He was reared in Dixon in Lee County, Illinois, and educated at Eureka College in Eureka, Illinois, with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics and sociology. Upon his graduation, he moved to Iowa to work as a radio broadcaster, and then in 1937 to Los Angeles, California, and became involved in the film industry. Ronald Reagan. Does that background sound like a leader? There was nothing that just jumped out. I mean, there was no military schools. I mean, there was no MIT. There was no, extreme intelligence. But he was probably, at least in my lifetime, probably one of the most effective leaders. So you see, leaders aren't born. You can learn to be a leader. Here's another one people have trouble with. Leadership is not based upon personality or age, because God uses introverts and extroverts as well as young and the old. Look at who. Look in the Bible, and we tend to think that a leader has got to be someone who is a real extrovert. Well, Paul was bold, right? Peter, he was a guy that jumped out of boats. Impetuous. But what about Timothy? What about all these other people that God called? There is not one characteristic of personality type. There's not one social class. But God looked at something else. Leadership is not management. And this is something that only over the last maybe 10 years has come to the forefront. Because typically, I remember when I used to go to, they even called them management schools. And basically, you would go to a management school and you wouldn't learn leadership, you would learn how to manage stuff. Management focuses on maintaining systems, processes, and organizations, while leadership is about influencing people to follow. Have any of you ever had a boss that was a manager but not a leader? Let me give you some things to look for. Leaders have vision and move people upward. Managers fight for the status quo. Leaders develop people to get things accomplished. Managers develop things to control people. Leaders are improvers. Managers are maintainers. Big difference there, huh? Now, let me ask you this. Is leadership moral or immoral? Well, it says right here it's neither, but it's based upon the focus. Look at these effective leaders. Some of the most effective leaders have been godly men. Joseph, David, Daniel, Paul, Jesus. They've accomplished great things. Similarly, equal effective ungodly leaders: Alexander the Great, Manasseh, Adolf Hitler, James Jones, Satan. They're effective leaders. Now let me ask you this. Was Adolf Hitler a good leader? Of course, you're saying, is this a trick question? If it's good from the standpoint of what he accomplished, no. But was he, let me phrase it another way, was he an effective leader? Think about this. A country, a relatively small country, not about the same size as Texas, nearly conquered the world. So you understand that leadership is a learned trait. You learn it, but then what that's used for determines whether it's moral or immoral. But I want you to understand that leadership is something that you learn. It's not based on your personality. It's not you were born or a leader or not a leader. It's not based on what you know, what you don't know right now. But God looks on the heart. Now, what I want to do, I want to spend just a few minutes at the end of this session, and I want to talk about something that, a concept that It's worth your time, folks. It's worth your time. And this applies to leaders, the leader-follower relationship, and it also applies to the development of a leader. Because you see, there are different stages, different levels of leadership. And when you understand this, you'll have a lot of aha moments. Oh, I understand what was going on. So let's look at this first level of leadership. This is the hand level. And people follow a leader because they have to. This is the first entry level of leadership. This is what happens when someone gets promoted to a supervisor. This is what happens when the teacher goes into the classroom that first day. This is what happens when a pastor goes to that church for the first time. They lead at the hand level. The next level is called the head level. And people follow because it's smart to follow. In other words, they understand this leader makes good choices, good decisions, therefore, I want to follow them. But then, the highest level of leadership is what's called the heart level. And this is where people follow because they want to. They want to. Now, what does all this mean? Let's talk about the hand level. This is where people follow because they have to. The name's on the door. Boss, supervisor, pastor, teacher, whatever. You're the teacher, I'm the student, so I'm supposed to follow you. And that's the hand level. This is sort of the honeymoon phase. This is where people will generally give a leader the benefit of the doubt. And there's not too many problems starting out because they have no experience with that person. And so they don't know what's best. And every new leader, going into a new position or just being a new leader, you start out at the hand level. When you go to a new church, you start at the hand level. Now, if you stay at the hand level, you're not going to be a leader unless you use force. Who are some leaders that try to operate at the hand level and keep things under control? I've had to change my notes on this because I used to say that Mubarak in Egypt was a leader at the hand level, a dictator. Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria. Out of those three, two of them are already gone. So you see, leading at the hand level is a limited position unless you can keep people under subjection for a long period of time. And in most positions, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's the hand level. Let's move on up to the head level. All of these steps are accumulative and they're conditional. In other words, you've got to start at the hand, then you move to the head. What does the head look like? The head looks like the leader makes good decisions. The followers are watching and evaluating, and they're asking, how does that affect me? And if the leader's making good decisions, they think, well, I'll follow that person because he makes good decisions, and he'll make good decisions for the church, for the corporation, for the class, or whatever. But this is, honestly, folks, what we have right now with our president. He's at the hand level. He's at the head level. Now, I say the head level because people are saying he will give me something. It will be good for me. But again, you're not going to stay in that position at the head level. Let's look at the heart level. And this is honestly, folks, few people get to this level. Who are these people? Think of your favorite teacher, your favorite boss. Think of your favorite pastor. Now, those people led and lead at the heart level. What's the heart level? The heart level is, remember I told you the biblical model of leadership, where a leader leads for the benefit of those that he leads? At the heart level, people follow because they want to, because they know that that leader has their best interest at heart. Now, that answers questions. If you're a teacher, that answers why the first few weeks of school are horrible. And why the last few weeks of school, even though you're ready to get out of there, there's that tug on your heart of, I'm going to miss them. Why? Because you've established that relationship with them, you've invested in them, and they come to know that you have their best interest at heart. Folks, when a leader's that level, people will follow him to the gates of hell. You don't have to watch them, control them, because they want to. Why? Because you've invested in them. Let me give you an illustration. I had a peer at one time. It was a fairly high position. We both had these positions. He was extremely intelligent. He was extremely creative. He was good at what he did. But people noticed when he made decisions, it was based on what was best for him. And he never understood this, that he had reached from the hand level to the head level, but he never reached the heart level because people didn't trust him. That's the point, folks. A leader that leads at the heart level, they know, the followers know that I can trust you. People truly don't care what you know until they know that you care. Now, of all these three levels, it's interesting when you look at this, because all three levels are necessary and none can be skipped. And each time a leader changes position or new followers come into the group, both the leader and the follower move back to the hand level. What am I saying? A pastor could have had a tremendous pastorate at one church, but he moves to another church. What level is he going to start with that church? He's going back to the hand level. He's going to have to go back from the hand to the head to the heart. This is what happens, I said, with teachers. You get a new class. You got to move through those levels again. An interesting thing, too, is what if a new person comes into a group? You're a small group leader, okay? And you've got a group and everybody has bonded and they know you have their best interest at heart, and someone new comes into that group and you expect them to have the same trust in you that the other people have in you. Do you think that's going to happen? Where are you going to start with them? The hand level. They're going to come in and they say, okay, you're the small group leader, so we'll see. Then they'll watch decisions you make, and then they'll want to know how your heart is. Do you really care for them? And when you get to that level with a person, but that's what you need to understand as a leader. When you go into a new position, say you move in a company from one area to another, don't expect to go in there at the heart level. You're going to have to go back to the hand level, and move to the head, and move to the heart. Same thing when someone else comes into your group. That relationship's going to start. So you see, leadership is about relationships. And to have influence with people, folks, you've got to invest in them. You've got to spend time with them. That's why some people say, I want to be a leader like that. But they're not willing to pay the price. Because you see, it's investing in people to get through those 3 levels. Now, what level do you think is most effective and you're going to accomplish the most? Heart level, right? That goes back to what I said. If a pastor were at a church for 2 years, chances are they're never going to reach the heart level. Boss that goes into, or what if you own a company and you start out and you build a good group of people and you get a new person that comes in to that group. You as the boss, what level are you going to start with them? Back at the bottom, right? Now, if you have a whole group, whether it's a church or corporation or an organization or whatever, and the boss is able to reach the heart level with them, that's where you're going to have an impact. That's where you're going to accomplish things. That's what you're striving for as a leader. But it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort invested in those people. Okay, let's take a break. And when we come back, I want to talk with you about some qualifications for leaders. And they might be a little different than what you think.